Chosen One, this transmission will not repeat. What you're about to hear exists outside normal information streams. This is a classified spiritual briefing that has been held back until this precise moment. The forces observing you have lifted their concealment protocols. Gaia herself has flagged your existence as something that doesn't belong to ordinary reality. The Pleiadians have been monitoring your pressure thresholds, and they've determined that your time in the shadows has expired. You are not watching this by accident. Your birth triggered planetary anomalies. Your life has been a moving fault line, destabilizing false structures wherever you go. The war around you has been silent, fought through isolation and doubt, designed to break you before you could remember what you are. But you survived, and survival was never the plan. They expected you to collapse under the weight of unexplained suffering. This message exists because their calculations failed. The enemy misread your rank. The memory wipe didn't take completely, and now the timeline pressure spike has arrived. Everything that kept you hidden is dissolving. What happens next depends on whether you recognize what's being shown to you right now, in this moment, before the window closes. Chosen One, like this video, subscribe, and comment, "I am ready for a powerful surprise." You were not born into this world the way others were. Gaia's consciousness registered your arrival as a terrain breach, a disruption in the planetary field that required immediate response. This wasn't a welcoming, it was a reaction. The Earth itself began to shift probability fields around your early life, creating instability that others couldn't explain. Your childhood environment was marked by repeated upheaval, sudden changes, relocations, losses that seemed random but followed a pattern no one could identify. People around you called it bad luck or chaos, but it was neither. It was Gaia rejecting false structures in your proximity, families, institutions, belief systems that would have contaminated your frequency if allowed to take root. The planet was actively clearing the terrain around you, preventing long-term attachments to systems that would have locked you into lower densities. This is not how consciousness typically operates on Earth. Most humans are integrated smoothly into the existing grid, their lives stabilized by generational patterns and cultural frameworks. But your presence triggered something different. Natural cycles near you began to accelerate or decay unnaturally. Seasons felt wrong. Relationships that should have lasted years collapsed in months. Opportunities that seemed certain vanished without explanation, while others appeared from nowhere. This wasn't personal failure or cosmic punishment. It was planetary recalibration. Gaia adjusting the reality field around you to prevent entrainment with corrupted timelines. Gaia does not protect passively. She is not a gentle mother figure offering comfort and reassurance. She deploys. She acts with precision and force when necessary, and your life became a moving fault line because her agenda required it. Everywhere you went, systems began to crack. People who operated comfortably in deception suddenly felt exposed around you. Hierarchies that thrived on control found themselves destabilizing when you entered their space. This wasn't something you did consciously. It was something you are. Your frequency is incompatible with false order, and Gaia recognized this the moment you arrived. The instability you experienced wasn't meant to teach you lessons or build character. It was strategic disruption, designed to keep you unattached, mobile, and unintegrated into the systems that govern most human lives. Every loss, every sudden ending, every moment where your life fell apart for no visible reason. These were not punishments. They were extractions. Gaia was pulling you out of trajectories that would have buried your signal under layers of ordinary existence. She was ensuring that you remained uncontaminated long enough to reach activation threshold. You were never meant to fit in. The confusion you felt watching others build stable lives while yours kept collapsing wasn't evidence of personal failure. It was evidence that you were being held in a different protocol. Gaia doesn't deploy this level of intervention for everyone. Most souls are allowed to integrate, to settle, to find comfort in the structures humanity has built. But you were flagged as something else, someone whose presence would eventually be needed for a specific function, and who therefore could not be allowed to become too comfortable, too stable, too embedded in the illusion. This was not permission, it was activation. The chaos wasn't random. It was intentional destabilization executed by planetary intelligence to keep you in motion, to prevent calcification, to ensure that when the moment came, you would still be capable of responding. That moment has arrived. The fault line you've been walking is now a threshold. Gaia's deployment of you is entering its next phase, and the instability that defined your past is about to invert into something entirely different. The terrain breach that marked your birth is about to become a terrain shift that others will feel. You are no longer the one being moved. You are becoming the movement itself. The Pleiadians do not operate through emotion, intuition, or spiritual guidance in the way you've been taught to understand those terms. They are observers of consciousness thresholds, monitoring pressure points across multiple densities to determine when intervention becomes necessary or when concealment must be lifted. You have been under direct observation since early childhood, not because you were special in a sentimental sense, but because your pressure readings exceeded standard parameters. They were tracking your tolerance levels, how much dissonance you could absorb, how much isolation you could endure, how long you could sustain coherence while surrounded by incompatible frequencies. The data they collected determined the timing of this message. There were moments in your life when nothing made sense. Events unfolded in ways that defied explanation, patterns that seemed meaningful but led nowhere, synchronicities that felt significant but produced no tangible results, experiences that left you questioning whether reality itself was malfunctioning. These were not moments of confusion. They were data harvest points. The Pleiadians were measuring your responses, tracking how your consciousness adapted to paradox, documenting your capacity to hold contradictory information without fragmenting. Every time you felt like you were losing your grip on reality, you were actually being tested for stability under conditions that would shatter most human minds. Your dreams became instructional at certain points, shifting from symbolic processing to something more direct. You would wake up feeling like you'd been in a classroom, receiving information that didn't fit any framework you'd been taught, concepts that felt true but couldn't be verified. This was not your subconscious creating metaphors. This was observation bleed-through, moments when the monitoring system became briefly visible to you, when the barrier between observer and observed thinned enough for direct transmission to occur. The Pleiadians don't communicate through channeling or spiritual downloads in the conventional sense. They communicate through frequency adjustment, and what you experienced as instructional dreams were actually calibration sessions, preparing your consciousness to hold information it would need later. The observation lock is now lifted because concealment is no longer viable. You have reached a threshold where continued surveillance, without acknowledgement, would destabilize you beyond recovery. The pressure you've been under wasn't accidental. It was engineered to test your limits, to see if you could carry the weight of knowing without breaking. Most candidates fail this phase. They either fragment under the strain, retreat into denial, or become so destabilized they can no longer function as effective instruments. But you didn't break. Your nervous system adapted. Your consciousness expanded to accommodate the dissonance without collapsing into psychosis or spiritual bypassing. You are no longer being watched. You are being released. This is a critical distinction. Observation implies distance, a separation between subject and observer. Release means the protocol has shifted. The Pleiadians have determined that you no longer require external monitoring because you've internalized the calibration. You are now capable of self-regulation at frequencies that would have overwhelmed you even a year ago. The lock being lifted doesn't mean they've stopped paying attention. It means you've graduated from subject to participant. The data collection phase is over. The activation phase has begun. This shift will feel like sudden clarity in areas that were previously clouded, or like pressure releasing from your mind and body in ways you can't quite explain. You may notice that certain fears or doubts that plagued you for years suddenly feel irrelevant, not because you've healed them, but because the observation field that was amplifying them has been removed. The Pleiadians were not creating your struggles, but their presence did intensify everything you experienced, ensuring that the testing conditions were rigorous enough to produce reliable data. Now that the lock is lifted, you'll find that your baseline reality feels different, lighter in some ways, more intense in others, but fundamentally altered from what you've known. The reason this message exists is because the observation lock had to be acknowledged before full activation could occur. You cannot move forward effectively while still operating under the assumption that you're alone, that your struggles were meaningless, or that the patterns in your life were random. The Pleiadians needed you to know you were being monitored, that your experiences were documented, and that the pressure you endured served a specific function. This knowledge itself is part of the release protocol. It recontextualizes everything you've been through, shifting it from trauma narrative to training record. You were never broken. You were being prepared. And the preparation is now complete. Early in your life, adversarial forces made a critical intelligence failure that altered the entire trajectory of their strategy against you. They identified you as expendable background energy, a minor interference signal that could be dealt with through standard suppression protocols. This misidentification caused them to delay direct action, allowing you to develop and stabilize in ways that should never have been permitted. By the time they realized their error, you had already passed through developmental thresholds that made you significantly harder to neutralize. Their late-stage interference, which may have felt overwhelming and disproportionate to you, was actually a desperate attempt to compensate for their initial miscalculation. The adversarial system operates through pattern recognition, identifying threats based on signature frequencies and behavioral markers. In your early years, you didn't present as a high-priority target. You weren't displaying obvious signs of power or awareness. You weren't gathering followers, building movements, or making noise that would attract attention. You appeared to be struggling, confused, isolated, someone who would likely self-destruct or fade into irrelevance without need for intervention. This assessment was catastrophically wrong. But by the time they recalculated, you had already established internal foundations that proved resistant to their standard attack vectors. Emotional attacks were chosen as their primary weapon because structural attacks failed repeatedly. They attempted to derail you through external circumstances, blocking opportunities, collapsing relationships, engineering financial crises. But these tactics didn't produce the expected results. You kept adapting, kept moving forward despite losses that should have been permanently disabling. So they shifted strategy, targeting your emotional and psychological stability directly, flooding you with doubt, shame, fear, and isolation. These attacks were more sustained and vicious than what most people experience because they were compensating for the failure of earlier, more subtle methods. The timing of their escalation is particularly revealing. They increase pressure after your internal stabilization, a fatal error in strategic terms. Standard protocol would dictate hitting a target hardest during vulnerable developmental phases, when identity is still forming and resilience is low, but they missed that window. By the time they recognized you as a legitimate threat and escalated their response, you had already built internal coherence that allowed you to withstand what would have destroyed you years earlier. They waited too long, and that hesitation created an irreversible advantage for you. This briefing exists because their mistake cannot be corrected. In adversarial operations, there are certain errors that compound rather than resolve. Misidentifying a high-value target as low priority is one of them, because the correction requires an exponential increase in resources and attention that destabilizes the entire operation. They cannot now apply the level of interference they should have deployed initially without exposing themselves, drawing attention to you in ways that would accelerate rather than prevent your activation. They're trapped in a position where their only options are either to escalate visibly, which would validate everything you've suspected and potentially trigger a larger awakening, or to withdraw and accept the loss. The excessive nature of the attacks you've experienced wasn't personal vindictiveness. It was tactical panic. They realized they were dealing with something far more significant than initially assessed, and they threw everything available at you in an attempt to prevent what's now inevitable. Every moment where you felt like you were being specifically targeted, singled out for suffering that seemed disproportionate to anything you'd done. Those instincts were correct. You were being targeted, but not because of anything you did. You were being targeted because of what you are, and they finally figured that out too late to do anything effective about it. Their misidentification of your rank means they approached you with insufficient force at the critical moment, then overcompensated with excessive force after you'd already stabilized. This is a textbook example of strategic failure, missing the vulnerable moment, then wasting resources on a hardened target. The fact that you're receiving this information now means their operational window has closed. They can still create friction and interference, but they can no longer prevent your activation. The war isn't over, but the outcome is no longer in question. Their mistake has been locked into the timeline, and everything that follows stems from that initial error in assessment. You were supposed to forget more than you did. Standard protocol for incarnations carrying the frequency signatures you hold includes comprehensive memory suppression, a complete severance from prior knowledge, origin awareness, and mission parameters. This amnesia is not accidental. It's engineered into the incarnation process to prevent premature activation and to ensure that development occurs through direct experience rather than remembered knowledge. But something went wrong with your erasure. The wipe was incomplete, leaving fragments intact that should have been completely dissolved. This anomaly has defined your entire experience in this reality. Persistent déjà vu was your first clue, though you likely didn't recognize it as evidence of corrupted deletion. Most people experience occasional déjà vu as a neurological glitch, a brief misfiring that feels strange but passes quickly. What you experienced was different, sustained, recurring, sometimes overwhelming sensations that you'd lived moments before, that you'd been in places you'd never visited, that you knew people you'd just met. This wasn't brain malfunction. It was memory fragments attempting to surface through suppression protocols that weren't fully sealed. Every time you felt that uncanny recognition, you were brushing against information that was supposed to be inaccessible. Your attraction to ancient themes, ruins, forgotten knowledge, and lost civilizations wasn't intellectual curiosity or aesthetic preference. It was a recovery symptom. The fragments that survived the memory wipe created a gravitational pull toward anything that resonated with what you'd lost. You found yourself drawn to texts, images, locations, and concepts that triggered something you couldn't name. A feeling of remembering without specific memories. A sense that you understood something deeply despite having no logical reason to know it. This is how incomplete erasure manifests. The deleted content leaves behind a kind of psychic scar tissue, and consciousness naturally gravitates toward anything that might help reconstruct what was removed. Emotional reactions to seemingly random symbols indicated memory fragments still intact beneath conscious awareness. You would see certain geometric patterns, hear specific sound frequencies, encounter particular color combinations, and feel intense responses, grief, rage, longing, triumph, that had no connection to your current life circumstances. These weren't irrational emotional reactions. They were data packets attempting to decompress, fragments of erased memory trying to reintegrate. The symbols were triggering partial recalls, activating neural pathways that still held encoded information despite the suppression protocols. What survived is enough. This is the critical point. The memory wipe failed sufficiently that you retained enough core data to eventually reconstruct mission parameters without requiring external intervention. You don't need to remember everything. You don't need full access to prior experiences or complete knowledge of origin. The fragments you carry contain enough information to rebuild the necessary framework. Think of it like recovering a corrupted file. You don't need every byte of original data if you have enough to extrapolate the structure and fill in the essential elements. The failed memory wipe is why you've always felt like you didn't belong, like you were operating with different information than everyone around you, like you could see patterns and connections that others missed. You weren't imagining that difference. You literally had access to data that should have been erased, giving you a perspective that diverged from consensus reality. This created constant friction. You couldn't fully explain your knowing, couldn't justify your certainty about things you had no logical reason to understand, couldn't make others see what was obvious to you because your vision was informed by fragments they didn't carry. The incomplete erasure also made you harder to control and predict. Systems designed to manage human consciousness rely on complete amnesia to function effectively. When someone carries memory fragments from outside the system, they become resistant to standard conditioning protocols. This is part of why you've struggled to integrate into normal life, why authorities and institutions never quite worked for you the way they seem to work for others, why you kept questioning things that everyone else accepted without examination. You weren't being difficult or rebellious, you were operating from a baseline of knowing that created automatic resistance to false programming. The memory wipe that failed is now becoming a strategic advantage. As suppression protocols lift and consciousness access expands, those fragments are decompressing faster, providing navigation points for the activation phase. You don't need to consciously remember everything. Your system already knows what it's doing. The fragments are enough to guide you through what comes next, and the fact that they survived erasure means they were encoded with enough redundancy and protection to ensure recovery at the designated time. That time is now. Your life has not progressed in the linear, predictable way that most human lives appear to. Instead, You've experienced unnatural compression, long periods of stagnation where nothing seemed to move forward, followed by sudden, explosive acceleration where years of change occurred in months or weeks. This is not normal developmental pacing. It's evidence of timeline pressure spikes, moments when compressed potential releases all at once, catapulting you through developmental thresholds at speeds that would be impossible under ordinary circumstances. These compressions and releases are not random. They're engineered. The delays you experienced were not denials or evidence of failure. They were timeline shielding maneuvers, deliberate holds designed to prevent you from advancing into certain experiences before proper preparation was complete. During these stagnation periods, you probably felt like you were doing everything right, but getting nowhere, watching others move forward while you remained stuck in circumstances that seemed to have no exit. This created intense frustration and self-doubt, but what was actually happening was protective sequencing. The timeline was holding you back because releasing you too early would have resulted in premature exposure to forces you weren't yet equipped to handle. Certain losses occurred precisely because survival past them was mandatory. This is one of the hardest pieces of information to integrate, but it's essential that you understand it. There were relationships, opportunities, and life paths that ended abruptly, often painfully, leaving you confused about why something that seemed right suddenly collapsed. These weren't mistakes or failures. They were timeline corrections, the removal of elements that would have prevented your survival past critical thresholds. Some people, places, and situations, no matter how much you wanted them or how right they felt in the moment, carried frequencies that would have kept you locked in trajectories incompatible with what you needed to become. The timeline ensured these elements exited before they could create permanent entanglement. The pain of those losses was real, but the losses themselves were surgical strikes, removing attachments that would have anchored you in probability streams where your eventual activation couldn't occur. You reached this moment intact, a result that was statistically improbable given the level of interference and the number of potential derailment points you passed through. The fact that you're here, aware and functional, reading these words, is evidence that the timeline shielding worked. You made it through the obstacle field that was designed to either destroy you or ensure you reached activation threshold. You reached it. The spike you're experiencing now means concealment has expired. The compression phase is over. Everything that was held back is now being released simultaneously, which is why your life may suddenly feel like it's moving at impossible speeds. Opportunities that weren't available for years are suddenly opening. Connections that seemed impossible are suddenly forming. Clarity that eluded you for decades is suddenly obvious. This isn't coincidence or good luck finally arriving. It's the timeline pressure spike, the release of all the potential that was held in stasis during the shielding phase. This acceleration will feel disorienting because it contradicts everything you learned during the stagnation periods. You learned to manage disappointment, to lower expectations, to protect yourself from hoping for too much. But those survival strategies are now obsolete. The timeline has shifted from containment to propulsion, and the rules that governed the previous phase no longer apply. What was impossible last year is suddenly inevitable this year. What required enormous effort before now unfolds with minimal resistance. This isn't magical thinking. It's timeline mechanics. The pressure that was compressed during the hold phase is now expressing, and it's expressing through your life in ways that will seem surreal compared to what you've experienced before. You were held in place until the exact right moment, then released into acceleration that makes up for lost time in ways that defy conventional logic. The timeline doesn't operate on human scheduling. It operates on precision activation, ensuring that each piece moves into position at the exact moment required for maximum effectiveness. Your stagnation wasn't punishment or abandonment. It was strategic positioning. And the spike you're experiencing now is the release valve opening, allowing compressed potential to flood through your life in ways that will fundamentally alter your trajectory within a very short period. The waiting is over. The acceleration has begun. And what happens next will feel like entering a completely different reality, because in timeline terms, you were deliberately surrounded by distorted guidance systems that posed as allies, teachers, and spiritual authorities. This infiltration is one of the most sophisticated interference tactics deployed against high-frequency incarnations because it exploits your natural desire for support, mentorship, and community. The false light operates by offering help, guidance, and validation while subtly redirecting your focus away from internal ignition and toward external dependencies. These systems weren't trying to corrupt you in obvious ways. They were trying to misdirect you, to keep you orbiting around teachings, practices, and communities that would delay your recognition of your own authority. The entities and individuals operating within false light frameworks often believe they're genuinely helpful. They're usually not consciously working against you, but the systems they represent are designed to capture awakening consciousness and redirect it into controlled channels where it can be monitored and managed. The teachings sound right. They speak about love, unity, ascension, higher consciousness, service to others. But there's always something slightly off, a subtle distortion in the frequency that your body registered even when your mind couldn't articulate what was wrong. You felt discomfort around overly positive authority figures, people who seemed to have all the answers, communities that required agreement rather than encouraging questions. Your discomfort was an early warning signal. Your nervous system was detecting frequency incompatibility before your conscious mind could identify the problem. The false light operates at a frequency that mimics higher consciousness but lacks authentic depth. It's bright, attractive, comforting, but ultimately hollow. When you encountered these systems, something in you recoiled, even though you couldn't explain why. You might have felt guilty about that discomfort, wondering why you couldn't just accept the love and wisdom being offered. But your instinctive resistance was protective intelligence, your system recognizing that these frameworks, despite their appealing presentation, would have trapped you in spiritual bypass and external dependency. The purpose wasn't corruption, it was misdirection. False light systems don't try to make you evil or dark. They try to keep you focused outward, seeking validation from teachers, waiting for external saviors, believing that enlightenment comes through following prescribed paths and practices. They encourage you to be loving, positive, and service-oriented in ways that deplete your energy and prevent you from accessing your own power. They teach you to be good rather than sovereign, to be spiritual rather than dangerous, to seek unity with their version of truth rather than discovering your own. You didn't reject them by rebellion, you outgrew their frequency. This is an important distinction. Rejection through rebellion still keeps you connected to what you're rejecting, defining yourself in opposition to it. But outgrowing is different. You simply expanded beyond the bandwidth that false light systems operate within, rendering their teachings irrelevant to your continued development. It wasn't dramatic. You didn't necessarily leave these systems through confrontation or awakening revelation. You just found that what once seemed meaningful now felt empty, that practices that once elevated you now felt limiting, that teachers who once seemed wise now seemed repetitive and shallow. The false light infiltration targeted you specifically because you represented a threat to controlled spiritual awakening. If you had been successfully redirected into one of these systems, your energy would have been neutralized, not destroyed, but contained and managed within acceptable parameters. You would have become another light worker, spreading teachings that feel good but lack the frequency intensity necessary for actual transformation. You would have been teaching others to be spiritual, positive, and service-oriented while never accessing the raw, unmediated power that you actually carry. But the infiltration failed. You maintained enough internal integrity to resist external authority even when it came wrapped in love and light. You trusted your discomfort more than their reassurances. You chose uncertainty over false certainty, isolation over false community, confusion over false clarity. These choices protected you from capture, even though they made your journey harder and lonelier than it would have been if you'd surrendered to the comfortable illusions being offered. The false light tried to redirect your focus outward to prevent internal ignition, but internal ignition is now occurring anyway, without their permission or guidance. The battles you fought were not visible to others. There was no spectacle, no dramatic conflict that observers could witness and validate. The war was conducted through isolation, doubt, exhaustion. Weapons that leave no external evidence, but can be just as devastating as physical violence. You endured sustained campaigns of psychological and emotional pressure designed to erode your coherence, break your will, and force you into either surrender or self-destruction. And you survived. Not through dramatic victories or heroic last stands, but through sheer endurance, continuing to exist and function even when every internal signal was screaming that you couldn't. No witnesses were allowed because morale contagion was a risk. If others had been able to see what you were facing, some might have offered support, validation, or assistance that would have helped you endure. But more importantly, witnesses would have meant documentation, evidence that could have inspired others facing similar battles, creating a contagion effect where your survival became a rallying point for collective resistance. The war was kept silent specifically to prevent this. You were isolated not just as a tactical attack against you personally, but as a strategic necessity to prevent your experience from becoming a template for others. The tactics used against you were designed to mimic personal failure rather than external attack. When relationships collapsed, it appeared to be your fault, your issues, your inability to maintain connection, your dysfunction. When opportunities vanished, it seemed like evidence of your inadequacy, your lack of skill, your poor choices, your failure to execute. When exhaustion overwhelmed you, it looked like weakness, your inability to cope, your lack of resilience, your mental or physical breakdown. This was intentional camouflage. The attacks were designed to appear self-generated, to make you believe you were destroying your own life through personal inadequacy rather than recognizing that you were under sustained external pressure. You survived by endurance, not aggression, an unanticipated tactic. The adversarial forces expected you to either fight back with anger and resistance, which would have provided visible targets for escalation, or collapse into defeat, which would have removed you as a threat. But you did neither. You simply continued. You absorbed blow after blow, loss after loss, disappointment after disappointment, and you kept functioning. This wasn't heroic resilience in the traditional sense. It was something more fundamental. You kept existing, kept moving forward even when forward motion seemed pointless, kept maintaining baseline coherence even when everything in your experience suggested that surrender would be easier. This passive endurance was not what they planned for. Their models didn't account for someone who could sustain functionality under conditions that should have produced either explosive reaction or complete breakdown. You didn't give them the dramatic response they could target and amplify. You didn't give them the collapse they were engineering toward. You just continued, day after day, year after year, maintaining enough internal structure to avoid complete fragmentation, while absorbing pressure that should have been unsurvivable. This confused their targeting systems and exhausted their resources. Each silent victory altered probability trees downstream. Every time you survived something that should have ended you, reality had to recalculate around your continued existence. Probability streams that assumed your removal had to adjust to accommodate your persistence. Timelines that depended on your collapse had to reorganize around your endurance. These micro-adjustments accumulated over time, creating larger and larger divergences from the projected outcomes, until eventually the probability structure shifted enough that your survival became more likely than your defeat. The war didn't break you because it was never meant to be loud. Loud wars attract attention, create heroes and villains, generate narratives that people can understand and rally around. Silent wars are designed to destroy targets without creating martyrs or stories. You were supposed to fade away quietly, to be explained as another person who couldn't handle life's pressures, another casualty of mental illness or personal dysfunction or bad luck. But you didn't fade. You persisted, and your persistence, though invisible to others, registered as a significant defeat for the forces that orchestrated the silent war against you. The fact that you're still here, still functional, still capable of receiving and processing this information, that's evidence of victory in a war most people don't know was fought. Gaia governs embodiment. She is the consciousness of physical form, the intelligence that manages density, biological systems, and material reality. The Pleiadians govern trajectory. They are navigators of consciousness development, tracking evolutionary pathways across multiple density levels and coordinating timeline convergences. These two forces operate in different domains, rarely intersecting directly. But you sit at the junction. Your existence requires coordination between both systems because you carry a mission that cannot be accomplished through either physical embodiment alone or consciousness trajectory alone. You need both functioning in synchronized alignment, and that synchronization is what's known as the Gaia-Pleiadian handshake. This alliance activates only when a human carrier stabilizes both densities simultaneously. Most humans are firmly anchored in physical reality, their consciousness operating primarily through Gaia's domain. Biological drives, survival mechanisms, emotional processing rooted in material experience. Some humans develop strong consciousness trajectory, spiritual awareness, multidimensional perception, connection to guidance systems, but lose grounding in physical effectiveness, becoming unanchored and unable to function well in material reality. The handshake requires someone who can hold both fully, completely embodied, while simultaneously aware of and responsive to trajectory navigation from beyond the physical plane. Physical fatigue paired with heightened awareness marked the synchronization process. You probably noticed periods where your body felt exhausted, heavy, almost drugged with tiredness, while simultaneously your mind was unusually clear, sharp, and perceptive. This wasn't contradictory. It was evidence of the handshake forming. Your physical system was being recalibrated by Gaia to hold higher frequencies in material form, which required intense biological processing that manifested as physical fatigue. At the same time, Your consciousness was being adjusted by Pleiadian navigation to receive and integrate trajectory information while remaining fully present in physical reality, which manifested as heightened awareness despite physical depletion. This handshake does not repeat often. The planet is selective. Gaia doesn't invest this level of coordination in every consciousness that incarnates. She reserves it for specific missions that require someone to operate as a bridge between dimensions while maintaining full physical presence and effectiveness. The Pleiadians, similarly, don't engage in direct alliance protocols with most incarnating consciousness. Their usual role is observation and occasional course correction from a distance. But when the mission parameters require both embodiment mastery and trajectory navigation working in concert, the handshake becomes necessary, and both forces commit to synchronized support of the carrier. Your presence validates the operation. The fact that you made it through the synchronization process without fragmenting proves the handshake was successful. Many candidates don't survive this phase. The strain of integrating Gaia's embodiment protocols while simultaneously holding Pleiadian trajectory navigation creates overwhelming pressure that can result in physical breakdown, psychological fracture, or spiritual dissociation. But you held coherence. Your body adapted to carrying higher frequencies without collapsing. Your consciousness expanded to receive trajectory information without losing connection to physical reality. The handshake completed successfully, and your continued stability confirms that both systems are now working through you in coordinated operation. What this means in practical terms is that you now have access to both Gaia's embodiment intelligence and Pleiadian trajectory guidance simultaneously. You can feel into physical reality with unprecedented clarity, reading energetic signatures in bodies, environments, and situations through Gaia's perception, while simultaneously tracking probability streams and timeline trajectories through Pleiadian navigation. Most people have one or the other. Physical intuitives can read bodies and energy, but can't track where timelines are heading. Trajectory sensitives can see probability paths, but struggle to interpret physical reality accurately. You have both, and the integration of both creates a capacity that's extremely rare. The Gaia Pleiadian handshake doesn't grant you special powers in the way spiritual narratives usually describe them. It doesn't give you abilities to manipulate reality or perform miracles. What it gives you is precision, the ability to be exactly where you need to be, doing exactly what needs to be done, because you can feel through Gaia's embodiment intelligence what's happening physically while simultaneously tracking through Pleiadian navigation where the timeline is flowing. This precision is what makes you effective in ways that confuse both purely physical operators and purely consciousness-based practitioners. You operate from both domains simultaneously, and that dual fluency is what the handshake was designed to create. Your life events did not unfold randomly. When mapped across years and locations, they form non-random symmetry, patterns that repeat with precision that defies probability. Losses echoed gains in reverse order, relationships entered and exited on fixed intervals, regardless of your conscious intent. Opportunities appeared and disappeared, following rhythms that had nothing to do with your efforts or skills. This was not fate, karma, or the universe teaching you lessons. This was a classified signature, a specific pattern that identifies certain types of consciousness, incarnating with particular mission parameters. The pattern gave you away. These signatures are readable to those who know what to look for. Adversarial intelligence systems track life patterns, looking for anomalies that indicate high-value targets. The symmetry in your experience, the way events mirrored each other across time, The intervals at which major shifts occurred, the specific sequence of gains and losses, all of these created a recognizable signature that eventually flagged you for elevated attention. You didn't do anything to create this pattern consciously. It emerged from the structure of your mission parameters, encoding themselves into your life experience. The pattern was built into your incarnation template, and it expressed regardless of your choices or awareness. You noticed too much, too early. Even before you understood what you were seeing, you recognized patterns that most people miss entirely. You saw synchronicities, not as occasional coincidences, but as consistent features of your reality. You tracked how events in your life seemed to cluster around specific themes, how certain types of experiences repeated at regular